before the blockade began, before the first U.S. warship took its position off Bandar Abbas, before Tehran made its announcement about the Strait of Hormuz, before any news camera arrived to cover the blockade, something happened in the dark. 40 meters below the surface of the Persian Gulf, in the black pressure silence that most people will never experience, a mission was executed. No announcement, no press release, not even a denial from the Pentagon. What U.S. Navy SEALs reportedly did this week to Iran's hidden command network, the communications infrastructure that connects Iran's missile batteries, its IRGCN fleet, and its command centers in Tehran, did not just disrupt Iranian operations, it blinded them. Before the blockade began, reports emerging this week describe a covert underwater demolition operation targeting a hardened fiber optic cable, Iran's secret military data line. The kind of communications infrastructure that, when severed, does not just interrupt a signal. It takes down an entire command network, simultaneously, without warning. In this video, we are going to break down what we know about this operation, what undersea covert demolition actually requires, what Iran lost the moment that cable went dark, and why cutting a cable in silence may be more strategically significant than anything the U.S. Navy has done above the waterline this week. What that cable was. To understand why this matters, you first need to understand what that cable actually was. Iran's military does not rely solely on satellite or radio for its most sensitive operational traffic. For the commands that coordinate missile launches, IRGCN naval movements, and air defense, Iran invested in hardened undersea fiber optic infrastructure, cable that moves data at the speed of light, cable that cannot be jammed, cannot be intercepted over the air, and cannot be detected from above. This is the backstop, the reliable channel when every other communication mode is compromised or watched. The U.S. objective was to degrade Iran's ability to execute a coordinated military response before the blockade became public. The obstacle is that these cables are specifically engineered to be nearly impossible to find, access, or destroy without highly specialized personnel and equipment. U.S. Navy SEALs, specifically Naval Special Warfare Command's maritime demolition specialists, are the only instrument in the American military built for exactly this mission. 3 parts. What SEALs can actually do underwater. The capability most people don't understand. What Iran lost operationally when that cable went dark. What the sequencing of this week's events tells us about the U.S. strategy in the Gulf. What SEALs can actually do in the dark. Naval Special Warfare Command does not publicize its underwater demolition capability in detail. That silence is by design. What is publicly documented is this. Navy SEALs trace their direct lineage to the underwater demolition teams, the UDTs, of World War II. The men who swam ahead of invasion beaches to map obstacles and clear lanes for landing craft. Combat divers operating in enemy-controlled water with nothing but knives and explosives. That tradition has been refined over 80 years into the most specialized underwater warfare capability on Earth. Modern SEAL combat divers use closed-circuit rebreather systems. That distinction is critical. A standard scuba diver exhales bubbles, visible, trackable, detectable at the surface, or by trained sonar operators at depth. A closed-circuit rebreather recycles exhaled gas back through the system. No exhaust, no bubbles, no acoustic signature, no surface indication that anyone is in the water. At depth, in current, in darkness, a SEAL team running on rebreathers is functionally invisible to every detection method the IRGCN uses to patrol cable routes and harbor approaches. Now, the demolition itself. Cutting a hardened fiber optic cable is not a matter of arriving with wire cutters. Modern military-grade undersea cables are armored. Multiple layers of galvanized steel wire wrapped over high-density polyethylene sheathing over the fiber bundle itself. Some military installations incorporate embedded sensors in the cable jacket designed to detect temperature changes or physical vibration consistent with tampering. Military demolition specialists use shape charges, specifically engineered devices that concentrate explosive force directionally to sever or irrecoverably damage the cable at precise points. Here is what separates disruption from destruction. Placing a charge at a single point creates a damage site that can be located and spliced by repair ships within days. The cable is down, but it is recoverable. Placing simultaneous severing charges at multiple points spread across separate locations along the cable route creates a damage pattern that takes weeks or months to fully repair. Each individual cut must be located by a cable ship, raised from depth, spliced, tested, and redeployed, in sequence, under surveillance. That is the difference between a temporary interruption and a communications catastrophe. That is the tradecraft, and it is the result of decades of investment in exactly this capability. What Iran lost when it went dark. Let's make this concrete. Iran's military command structure operates across multiple communication modes: high-frequency radio, military satellite links, and hardened landline, including undersea cable for maritime and coastal defense coordination. In a contested electromagnetic environment, which is exactly what the Gulf has become, satellite communication is vulnerable to jamming. Radio traffic is interceptable and exploitable by U.S. electronic warfare systems. Undersea cable is the backstop, the channel you trust when the others are compromised. When that cable goes dark, IRGCN naval commanders in Bandar Abbas lose secure communication with the missile batteries positioned along the Strait of Hormuz coastline. They cannot send encrypted coordination traffic to submarine operations. They cannot receive time-sensitive targeting data in a format the U.S. cannot intercept in transit. That is not a minor operational inconvenience. In a fast-moving naval confrontation, the kind that could develop within hours in the narrow geometry of the strait, the ability to coordinate in real time between command and dispersed forces is not an advantage. It is the baseline requirement for any coherent military response. Without the secure data line, Iran's swarm doctrine degrades from a coordinated multi-vector attack to individual IRGCN units, acting without synchronized command information, each boat captain making independent tactical decisions based on whatever radio traffic he can receive, which is exactly the traffic the U.S. Navy's electronic warfare suites are designed to intercept, exploit, and where necessary, disrupt. But here's the thing nobody is talking about. The cable cut did not just degrade Iran's operational capability, it sent a message about U.S. intelligence reach that may be more strategically significant than the damage itself. To locate and target that cable, U.S. forces had to know where it was routed. The precise GPS coordinates of a cable that Iran constructed and maintained as a covert military asset, not a commercial installation. That means one of two things. Either U.S. signals intelligence mapped the cable route over time by tracking electromagnetic emissions during installation and maintenance cycles, or human intelligence sources inside Iran's military provided the routing. Tehran is now asking which one, and not being able to answer that question is itself destabilizing to Iranian command culture. Because if your secure cable can be found, it means your operational security has a breach point you cannot identify. And that uncertainty corrodes every subsequent decision. The sequence no one covered. Pull back. What does a covert cable-cutting operation, executed before any public blockade announcement, tell us about how the U.S. approached this confrontation? Step back and look at what happened in sequence this week. Before any public announcement, the undersea cable cut. Iran's ability to mount a coordinated military response degraded before the blockade was disclosed. Simultaneously, the carrier strike group positioned. U.S. air superiority over Gulf airspace established. Then, the public blockade announcement. Iranian ports placed under visible surveillance. And Iran's response? a public declaration that the strait is completely open, followed within hours by reports that Tehran is now moving to reassert control over the strait, meaning Iran is currently attempting to operate naval units that have lost their primary secure communications channel, while being watched by a surveillance net they cannot break. Military planners call what the U.S. did this week preparation of the battlefield. It is the doctrine of removing an adversary's capacity to respond effectively before the confrontation begins, not to eliminate their forces, but to degrade their decision-making speed and coordination enough that the confrontation remains one-sided. In World War II, Allied strategic bombing targeted German radar installations and transportation infrastructure before D-Day, not because any single radar station was individually decisive, because the accumulated degradation meant the landing was survivable. The U.S. cut that cable for the same reason, not to win, to ensure that when the ships arrived at the port approaches, Iran would be reaching for a phone that wasn't working. Here is what remains uncertain. We do not yet know the full extent of Iran's operational degradation. Tehran will not disclose it. That would be both an intelligence gift to U.S. planners and a domestic political catastrophe for the regime. What we can assess from open-source reporting this week is that Iran's military commanders are operating in a degraded communications environment while facing the most capable naval blockade assembled in the Gulf since the tanker wars of the 1980s. And the U.S. Navy has said nothing about the cable. That silence is the same silence we saw in the days before the blockade was confirmed. It says, we can do this. We did do this. And the operation is not finished. The third layer. So where does that leave us? A public blockade above the waterline, a severed command network below it, an Iranian regime declaring control over a strait while its naval commanders work to coordinate forces through channels they know are being monitored. The U.S. has not fired a shot. It is not needed to. But there is a third dimension to what the U.S. has assembled in the Gulf this week that we have not yet covered. The electronic warfare dimension. U.S. Navy destroyers operating in Gulf waters are running active electromagnetic operations, not just surveillance, but active interference with Iranian military communications in real time. Combined with the loss of the undersea cable, Iran is now attempting to command and control its forces through channels it knows are compromised. That is not a military posture. That is a trap. Understanding how the U.S. wins this kind of confrontation, not with missiles, but with information control, that story changes the entire picture of what you've been watching this week. That story is next.